Good afternoon. Welcome to Dialogue Vanderbilt. My name is Yolanda Pierce, and I am honored to serve as the Dean of the Divinity School here at Vanderbilt University. This is part of a series of conversations that we are convening with leading faith experts, leaders, and scholars. And so we're delighted to have you here. Before we get into the conversation with our esteemed guests, I'd first like to welcome our Chancellor. An internationally renowned political scientist and management scholar, Daniel Diermeier is the 9th Chancellor of Vanderbilt University. Since joining Vanderbilt in 2020, Chancellor Diermeier has led an ambitious program of growth and advancement. He has driven efforts to become the destination for leading faculty and the most promising students to create a culture of radical collaboration and personal growth for Vanderbilt's faculty, students, and staff to expand Vanderbilt's global presence. I'm honored now to invite Chancellor Diermeier to welcome you.
Well, thank you very much, Dean Pierce. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's discussion hosted by Dialogue Vanderbilt. And I'm honored to welcome our guest speaker, Rabbi David G. Wolpe. Today's gathering is part of a series of conversations with faith leaders that aims to provide an open forum where we can explore the intersection of faith and the pressing issues that matter to us all, where we can share a range of perspectives and experiences through which we might come to better understand not only these issues, but one another, and our shared humanity, shared values, and our shared purpose of moving forward together toward a better world. As we gather here, in the days following our nation's annual recognition of Martin Luther King, and dealing with record-setting snowfall and now freezing rain here in Nashville, our hearts are fervently with those who are grieving and suffering as the result of the conflict in Israel and Palestine within both our global and our local communities. The tremendous weight of this human suffering is present among us, and thus, we do not enter into today's conversations lightly. We enter it somberly, but willingly and openly, in the spirit of mutual respect and joint commitment to the values of the Academy. And it is through this very act that we seek to offer that which universities so often provide when they're at their best: a platform for free expression and civil discourse where all people are welcome and all ideas can be meaningfully discussed. While today's event provides an example of a discussion on issues that feel, despite deep historical and ideological roots, intensely current, Vanderbilt's commitment to this type of illuminating dialogue is long-standing and deeply embedded in our mission to provide transformative education and path-breaking research. Ever since our founding, 150 years ago now, when a northern industrialist and a southern minister joined forces to create a university that could help move society forward after the devastation and division of the Civil War, our purpose has been to bring people of many viewpoints together to share their thoughts. We trace our tradition of providing a forum for opposing voices to at least the 1960s, when our Impact Symposia hosted speakers as diverse and as divisive as Stokely Carmichael, Storm Thurmond, Allen Ginsberg, and yes, also Martin Luther King. It was during that polarized era that Vanderbilt's 5th Chancellor, Alexander Hurd, explained our commitment to free speech and open discourse. He said, and I quote, "A university's obligation is not to protect students from ideas, but rather to expose them to ideas and to help make them capable of handling and hopefully having ideas. This same value guides us today. And today, we are called, perhaps more than ever, to enact it. With shouting matches replacing thoughtful debate everywhere, from the halls of Congress to school board meetings, and with more of us retreating into our ideological bubbles through the safety of curated news, we know that a college campus might be the lab where we can learn to converse, cooperate, and coexist. This is crucial for students learning to navigate civic life, for the future of democratic pluralistic government, and for the bold innovation that is needed to solve the urgent challenges we are all facing today. Our charge, after all, is to engage in urgent but ancient work, the work of Tikkun Olam, repairing the world, a world that we today often find broken and unfinished. This is a lofty charge and difficult work for which we will need a wealth of tools, including how to speak up and how to listen, how to understand, to reflect, to respectfully challenge and debate, and how to effectively communicate with others for the sake of needed change. We will have to be able to set the stage for the kind of peaceful and constructive dialogue that leads to understanding and ultimately to solutions. And that is what Dialogue Vanderbilt is all about. And while tonight's conversation is part of that, it is not just this conversation, or the one after, or the many more that will follow that will make a difference. It is a greater collective effort demanding that we all listen more willingly and more radically acknowledge the humanity in those with whom we may disagree, that will restore the time-honored standards of civil discourse to our society and set the stage for all the work that is to come. So tonight, I'm delighted to welcome on behalf of Vanderbilt and to our stage now two outstanding thinkers whose perspectives on faith, theology, and civic engagement I'm always eager to hear. Dear Yolanda and Rabbi David Wolpe, who will share their voices and views with us today. I'm deeply grateful to both of you for your time and for your work, and to all of you virtually now for joining us here. Let me conclude this introduction with some personal remarks. I've known Rabbi Wolpe now for many years, and I've been deeply impressed by his depth of insight combined with a profound humanity. F. Scott Fitzgerald famously said, "The test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposing ideas in mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function." Rabbi Wolpe will fiercely argue for his position, but always retain the ability to listen and to focus on our common humanity. And sometimes he even changes his mind. David, welcome to Vanderbilt.
The most influential rabbi in America, according to Newsweek. Rabbi David Wolpe is a columnist for New York Jewish Week and a Torah columnist for the Jerusalem Post. He has been published and profiled in the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, Time, Newsweek, and The Atlantic, and has been featured on The Today Show, Face the Nation, ABC This Morning, CBS This Morning, and PBS. The rabbi is a visiting scholar at Harvard Divinity School and the Max Webb Emeritus Rabbi of Sinai Temple in Los Angeles. The rabbi also serves as the inaugural Rabbinic Fellow for the Anti-Defamation League. He recently resigned from Harvard University's Anti-Semitism Advisory Group. We are delighted to welcome you here today. Thank you for being in conversation with me, Rabbi.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Chancellor, for that wonderful introduction. I might change my mind. We'll see.
Okay. So let me start off with a big question, but I think that really sets the groundwork. And the question is simple: why religion? And I ask why religion as a religion scholar, as someone like you who has devoted my life to the study of religion, to working with religious communities. But we also know the decline narrative, that religious communities are shrinking. There are fewer conversations about religion. And yet you seem really deeply committed to talking about religion in public life. And you seem committed to this idea that religion still has a role to play, particularly in a democracy. So let's just talk about why religion, especially given that religion has often been the source of such conflict and contention.
So I'll try to compress a big question into a smaller answer. I think the two major reasons why religion are values and community. That is, the reason that religion has been a source of contention in part is because religious people believe things. And when you believe something, sometimes you get carried away by how much you should defend it, although I think religion is less a source of contention than most people assume. I think that generally when religion is a source of contention, it's because other things are in play as well. Mm-hmm. There's land, there's resources, there's power. It's very rare that someone says, oh, I heard there's somebody on the other side of the world who doesn't believe what I do, let's go get them. Right. And especially in public life, the two things I think that America suffers from, and this is not an original diagnosis, I think most people would agree, are one, we're isolated, we don't have community, we haven't drawn together, and the one place in American life where different ages regularly sit with each other, sing with each other, aid each other is in houses of worship. Right. And the second is that we don't have a common vision of life. And so there's tremendous polarization and an inability to understand the values of the other. And the greatest statement that the monotheistic faiths make is found at the beginning of the Bible, which is that all human beings are created in the image of God. So there you have the principle that actually creates this ability to tie human beings together. And I think if people took religion seriously, as opposed to my team versus your team, mm-hmm. It's the greatest force for human unity that there is in the world.
Even given the differences, right? So I'm thinking about how in theological circles, and you're at Harvard Divinity School right now, we often talk about faith-seeking understanding, right? Like how the Abrahamic faiths can seek understanding with one another. And so I want to broaden the question to really about one of democracy, right? Which is the idea, at least here in the United States, is that this is a democracy that has religious pluralism at its very foundation. That people are often surprised to really hear about how religiously diverse early America was before this nation was even a nation. But the difficulty of that, of lots of different beliefs and value systems and faith systems, trying to figure out a way to be together, and what do we hold as our common core and our common identity that allows us to allow democracy to flourish, but also provide space for us to be within our individual communities and our commitments.
So I think it's really interesting to think about the fact that you're right, from the very beginning there was religious diversity in America, but there were religious wars in Europe, and yet there's never been a religious war in America. The Civil War was not different religious groups fighting each other.
Right.
And so somehow in America we actually have made it work, and I think the way we've made it work is by not having a single religious group that gets to impose its religion on everybody else. It's been precisely the sort of marketplace of ideas that, yes, I mean, as you know, we're not angels. We're human beings, and we're going to have division, and we're going to have anger, and we're going to have recrimination, and we're going to have polarization, and that's part of being human. But in America, remarkably, we have made it work in the sense that all these different religious groups coexist in the same country, and while they may not always get along very well, there's been no armed conflict between them, and we know that all around the world and in the history of the world, armed conflict between religious groups is not that rare. So I think America, we tend to focus obviously on the negative, but America has done it very well. Democracy is good for religion.
I love that attitude and approach. And I say that because I think my normally optimistic self sometimes feels very upset about when I look at a country, because there are certain dominant narratives. There are certain voices that get heard above other voices. And so while there has not been armed conflict, there certainly has been conflict. Absolutely. And I think we're in that moment here, not only because of global events, which we're going to talk about in a second, but the ways in which certain voices get to dominate the discourse. And sometimes we think we're talking about race, but we're actually talking about religion. Sometimes we think we're talking about religion, we're talking about race. And all of these things are intertwined in some hard ways. And so you, in your own work, talk about listening as part of how we can be with one another in respectful ways. Can you talk a little bit about
Sure.
how listening helps us?
So I draw this from my own tradition. One of the things, I mean, every tradition has its strengths and weaknesses. So now I'm going to talk about one of the strengths of my tradition, without question, is that we are trained to argue. And when you look at Talmud, which are rabbinic writings about the Bible, on every page, one of my first Talmud teachers said when he was a kid and he was learning Talmud, if he would like not pay attention in class, or he would sort of doze off and the teacher would say to him, "What's going on?" and he didn't know, his answer was always, "There's an argument." And he was always right, because there's an argument all the time. And the idea that the Talmud preserves minority opinions, things that will never come into law, but it still tells you what they said, suggests implicitly, it's like a training of every opinion should be heard and matters, because even if it doesn't win, in quotes, it's valuable and contains a seed of truth. There's a very famous passage in the Talmud that talks about two eminent rabbis, Hillel and Shammai, and it says both words on the opposite side of the argument are the words of heaven. They're the words, literally the words of the living God. And that idea that God is infinitely greater than our arguments, and that you have to listen, because even if the person is wrong, they're going to say something valuable that you need to hear, is, I believe, inherent both in the tradition and in the human condition. I'll just give you one more. One of my teachers once said that the best verse in the entire book of Joshua, if you want to search the book, you can decide whether he's right or not, is when Joshua sees an angel who's holding a sword, and he says, "Are you on our side or our enemies?" And the angel's answer is, "No, I'm an angel of the Lord of hosts." And that in that no, what you hear is that human beings always think in binaries. It's your or this, or that or that. And the ability to think larger than binaries in multiplicities is, I think, what faith ought to give us.
So I love this idea of listening, minority opinions, having space, room at the table from opposing viewpoints. We seem, though, to be in a moment where it is very difficult for us to hear one another, right? We're talking over one another. And I first want to identify that I know that part of that is pain. We are all responding right now to a conflict that is deeply painful, in which so many people are suffering. And so how we listen and talk with one another, I know, has a lot to do with the pain. But how can we hear each other right now? Even now, as the chancellor in his remarks and introduction suggested, on a college campus in which there are a lot of different voices. We have Jewish students, we have Muslim students, we have Palestinian students, we have Christians, you name it. You're on college campuses all of the time. They want to be heard. They want you to listen to their pain. They want to feel seen and valued. But how do we do that in a way that is respectful, but rises above sometimes the noise that doesn't allow us to listen to one another or respect each other's positions and viewpoints?
I think, first of all, it's important to acknowledge that literally in the midst of a war, it is sometimes impossible to listen to someone whose position you feel assaults your essence. And so I don't want to pretend that all you need to do is to care and to listen, because sometimes it's really impossible, and we tend to be able to listen when we're not deeply invested. Mm-hmm. So we have to give some space to the deeply invested to not be able to listen sometimes to some things. I think that that's okay. Having said that, I would start off with not how do you have to listen, but how do you have to speak. Because it's possible to speak in a way that makes it impossible for someone else to listen. So if I'm insulting you or diminishing you or putting you in a category that is a morally reprehensible one, it's going to be really hard for you to listen to me. Mm-hmm. And that's why the best way to, I think, to when someone expresses an opinion that you are really, like you have a fundamental objection to, is to ask them as many questions about how they arrived at it as possible. Because with enough whys, you usually get to a common human denominator that you can talk with. Why do you believe that? What have you heard about that? Why do you think that? And if the person is willing to speak to you as a human being and not as a member of a category or as a representative of a worldview that they don't like, then you can have a conversation. But the onus is not only on the listener, it's also on the speaker. Mm-hmm. You have to talk in a way that other people will be able to hear, and then you have to be willing to absorb the reality that you're not the only one with anger.
And so this is an ongoing issue on our campuses as we're also trying to talk about, well, what is dialogue, what is conversation, what is listening, but also what is hate speech?
Right.
What speech qualifies as so harmful to persons, to groups, to various entities, that a campus has to make decisions about, will we allow that to be said? So we're really struggling through this right now. And so when I think about the rise of anti-Semitism and anti-Semitism in spaces and in public life, I'm also concerned with where the goalposts, people afraid to speak. Sometimes the people who are most afraid to speak are the people we most need to hear. But then also a sensitivity to how hate speech harms. And because behind hate speech sometimes are hateful actions, right? And so how do you deal with not only anti-Semitism as a category, but the differences between what allows people to have free speech, but what would constitute hate speech? There is no answer that is satisfactory. None.
There was,
none whatsoever. We couldn't solve it.
Right,
if you and I could, we'd make a lot of money.
Right,
yeah.
exactly. It's so hard. In part because levels of sensitivity vary at different times, and also because, honestly, and I know that this is not, this doesn't help the discourse, but I can say the same thing in different tones with a different look, and you will receive one as, okay, that's an opinion I don't like, and the other as that's hate speech. Because a lot of hate speech is how you do it. Mm-hmm. So if you run up to every kid who's wearing a yarmulke, as I am, or a kippah, and say, from the river to the sea, that's clearly intended to be bullying, harassing speech. But if you express this idea that all Palestinians should be free, and you say doesn't that make sense to you, then I'm willing to enter a dialogue with you. And so it's not only the words, although it's often the words. I mean, there are certain words that are just unredeemed hate speech, and I think we could probably all agree on those. But it's the way that I approach you, and whether I'm approaching you in order to provoke and harass you, or am I approaching you in order to both express something and to hear you express back. And that's why a college campus has a sort of responsibility to create an atmosphere, as well as to say this you can say and that you can't say. It's never so mechanical. It's how you cultivate mutual respect.
Right. I acknowledge how hard that is. And not, I think, because the people involved are not great people who are trying to do their best, but I think that sometimes people feel scared. Sometimes people feel silenced. If I say this, will I be perceived in certain kinds of ways? Will I be attacked? And without creating, I think, forums where people can say stuff that is actually very, very difficult to hear, then we create an atmosphere where people would rather be silent than speak truth.
Right. Well, this is a very hard thing, because if you have a majority of people that believe X, then the person who believes Y, in order to express it, it's going to be hard. And it's, by the way, it's hard on both sides. Believe me, if there was a student I don't want to speak for Vanderbilt, I'm at Harvard. If there was a student who was a Trump supporter at Harvard, they would find it really hard to express that in a free way. And we have to recognize that this minority-majority dynamic works for every different kind of point of view, right and left. And I think that the solution, in as much as there is a solution, because there's no solution to the majority not liking what you say, you just have to live with it. To the extent that there is a solution, it's exactly what you said, which is if you can create forums where people can say things and they're not all of a sudden judged to be horrible human beings because they believe whatever it is they believe, then you give people a chance to expand on it enough so that you go, oh, I see. I understand now why you believe what you believe. When I have, for 26 years, I was a rabbi of a synagogue in Los Angeles. It was politically very divided. There were people on the far right and people on the far left, whatever those terms mean. And the only way that we were able to survive together is that we didn't start with politics. First, people sent their kids to the same school, and they went to the PTA meetings together, and they brought meals to people who were bereaved together, and they prayed together. And the problem with American society, in part, is since we have no common culture, we don't read the same books or go to the same movies or watch the same shows or read the same newspapers. The only thing we have in common is politics, and so that's all anybody talks about. Because I know, if I just met you this second, I know you have political opinions, and we can talk about the election.
Right.
But if I could start with your kids and your books and your whatever, and get to know you as a person, then by the time I got to politics, even if you disagreed with me, I would be interested why you disagreed with me, since we share so much else. Unfortunately, we don't do that enough. And I think that the common culture part of this would help a lot.
I love this idea of common culture. So let me share this little fact that is just one of those quirks, which is that you are the rabbi at Sinai Temple in Los Angeles. I grew up in a small church in Brooklyn that was called Mount Sinai. Huh. And Sinai is a real place, but it has a lot of theological significance for Jewish communities, for Christian communities. And this is just a little quirk. When I saw that in your bio, I was like, I wanted to mention it to you even before we started speaking. But I bring it up now is because part of our difficulty is that we don't know enough about history, right? And so for a community to not know where Sinai is, what it meant, what it represents, and even theologically for those particular communities, they miss certain kinds of nuances, right? How do we work harder to get to an understanding when something is rooted and grounded in history that's sometimes thousands of years old, right? It has something that is as ancient as days, and we're very, very like modern, contemporary, whatever's happening 2 minutes ago. But how do we do that when it actually would require some work on our part?
So Hannah Arendt, who was a philosopher and an important thinker in the 20th century, said, in every generation, the world is invaded by barbarians, and they're called children. And you have to civilize them. And it's true because children are born into the world with no culture, and they have to be acculturated. And part of a piece of our problem is that we're acculturating our children to the second hand of history instead of the calendar of history. That is, they see what happens every second on social media, but that doesn't give any context for what Sinai is. And I think this is a malady that America suffers from anyway, but the ignorance of history and the depth of things and the realization that there was a world before you came into it is something that's, I think that is exactly the job of an education, and especially of a university, is to teach people that is true, and that you can't actually understand almost anything without knowing what preceded it. It's one of my favorite bits about this is Chesterton's fence rule. Chesterton says, if you come across a fence in a field and you don't see any reason why that fence should be there, you're not allowed to knock it down. If you know why it was put up in the first place, and now you know that purpose is no longer important, you can knock it down. But the point is, if you don't know the history of something, then you will inevitably misunderstand it because you don't know where it came from.
Do you think that this is what is happening for many Americans as they are watching the war that is now waging in the Middle East, as they are listening to news or social media, they are watching the TikToks that we are seeing from our Palestinian brothers and sisters, from our Jewish brothers and sisters? Do you think that we don't know enough about the conflict? Or is it that, well, even if we don't know enough about the conflict, the opinions and the strong emotions and the ideas that we have, are they still as valid? Do we need more of a history lesson?
So it depends who and what. I think that most people who express feelings about the conflict have no idea about its history. I think that's true, but I don't only think that that's true of this conflict. I mean, I think if you ask the average American, what do you think of the conflict in Kashmir or Nagorno-Karabakh, they're not going to give you a very educated answer either. The difference is that they think they know about this one, and they know they don't know about that one. So yeah, there is, I believe, a lot of ignorance around the history of the Middle East, and also the Middle East is one of those places that has way too much history. It's like, it's really besotted with historical significance. And then I think the other piece of what's going on is that ideology very heavily influences your view of the conflict, and the ideology is actually an ideology that was born and exists and is applied here, but doesn't actually have very much to do with what goes on there. So Americans, because we are culturally insulated, And that's as a result of the fact that we have Canada, Mexico, and 2 oceans, which gives us geographical blessedness that is known by maybe by no other nation in the world, maybe Canada. But that means that we look at a place where there's lots of conflict and we apply our American eyes to it. But if you actually go to the Middle East, it's a very different sort of place with different ideas and different conflicts than you would assume growing up in America. And so the transference doesn't work, but you have to study the place and learn it and understand it, I think, to know that.
So much because this is happening in real time for us. I think that, especially when I think of, again, being on a university campus, students are reading history, even if that history just took place 20 years ago, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas this is happening in real time. We are watching bombs in real time. We're watching the rubble in real time. And so because of that immediacy of it, I think people are... Some people feel paralyzed because they don't know what to do. They don't know how to help. Obviously people are angry, people are sad, people are suffering, their families involved in this. There's so much here. How do we deal with the immediacy of it?
Well,
what can we do?
Part of the immediacy is the fact that if you look at the percentage of coverage that Israel gets in the newspapers of the world, I just heard a reporter that said the other day, he said when he worked at the AP, of 80 foreign reporters, 60 were in Israel and 20 were scattered around the rest of the world. The intensity of coverage, there are genocides in the Sudan, there was a genocide in Rwanda, there were many, many more Syrians killed than have been killed in the whole history of the Arab-Israeli conflict in the last 20 years. In the last 10 years probably, but there is no coverage of that, and so there is no emotional reaction to it. And a lot of what we feel depends on what we see, and what we see is not what we determine to see. We have to ask ourselves, why is this the conflict that gets covered, and why does it get covered the way it does, and is what we are seeing the objective facts of the conflict? And we can't really know that. I remember when the bombing of the El Shifa hospital came out and it was said that 500 people had been killed and it was an Israeli bomb, and that story went around the world for a couple days until it was discovered that actually it was an Islamic Jihad misfired bomb and it hit the parking lot, not the hospital, and about 7 people were killed. Still a tragedy, but obviously not what we had originally assumed. And so part of my answer to you is not that people ought not to feel for the many innocent lives that have been taken. They should. But what you feel and how you interpret the conflict are 2 different things. So you can see tragedy and say, this is happening for reason X or Y or Z. And one person's reason why this is happening is going to be different from my reason why this is happening. I think that, I would make the argument that the reason so many civilians are being killed is because you have a group that attacked a country and then went back and hid in schools, in hospitals, in civilian areas, in tunnels that they built at tremendous expense, 400 miles of tunnels now they've discovered, and yet did not build a single bomb shelter for any civilians anywhere in Gaza. And why is that? So I have a different perspective on what's going on in terms of the deaths of civilians in Gaza and I feel it the same way. It's like, I think that it's horrific and tragic and awful and unspeakably painful. But why it's going on is a different conclusion from feeling that it's going on.
So I think that before we turn to, and there are questions that have been submitted, so I want to make sure we get to those questions. I think that sometimes we'll know things in the fullness of time, right? And that's what I mentioned about the kind of immediacy of it. So we get an image and we react to that image, and the fullness of time has proven some information to be correct and some information to be incorrect. But I do think that here, an ocean plus away, communities are always asking, what can we do? How can we help? How can we make a difference? How can we, in some ways, make this conflict less dangerous, less bloody, less killing of children and civilians? And when we don't have the answer to that, we feel powerless, or we also feel maybe angry because our tax dollars are supporting this. I want to put the full range of possibilities of where people are entering into the discourse, because I'm still struck with, and I think I know that you are as well, where do we go?
Right.
Where do we go with this? And maybe it's back to your first, the why religion question. Sometimes the only way to process this is with community, because where are people processing what they're experiencing, what they're seeing, all of the communities involved?
I think that the two things that I would hope for that seem to me would be ultimately, are there solutions that would be ultimately solution forward, is one, to acknowledge the suffering of all those who are suffering, and not to just say, oh, people are only suffering on my side, and two, to be willing to acknowledge the legitimacy of the existence of all those who exist in the Middle East. And I really believe if those two things happened, you would be 80% there towards a solution. So to the extent that we can model that here,
Yes.
I think that would be a wonderful thing.
Thank you so much. I need to go into a Q&A session. We know that you all are not physically present with us, but several folks sent in questions, and some of them are very, very big, and including the first one,
best.
which is, how has Judaism changed since you were growing up? That's probably a very, very big question, but that was the first one that was submitted. So if you have maybe just a
How has
quick
Judaism changed? I mean, when I was growing up, among other things, there were no female rabbis, and when I retired from my synagogue, a husband and a wife took over, and that's a huge change. It's been a change all throughout society. It was very rare to have music in services. Now it's common in non-Orthodox services to have music, in Orthodox services not. It was, I think the image of rabbis has changed in different ways. There have been different movements. The Chabad movement has expanded enormously since I was a kid, exists now worldwide. There have been lots and lots and lots of different changes. I also do believe that of late, we have recognized a degree of anti-Semitism that I did not really feel or experience when I was growing up.
And that leads actually into the second. We had several questions about anti-Semitism. Do you have a working definition of anti-Semitism? What do you think is at the root cause of the rise in anti-Semitism? So several questions about that, actually, explicitly.
Anti-Semitism is hatred of Jews, and it's expressed in lots of different ways. And the question that often gets asked is, what attitudes towards Israel constitute anti-Semitism? If you believe that of all the states in the world, the only state that shouldn't exist is the state, not the 50 Muslim states, not the 21 Arab states, not all the states of Europe, not Germany after the World War, not Russia after it invaded Ukraine, but Israel should not exist, that seems to me by implicitly an anti-Semitic statement. That you would single out the only state that has ever existed for Jews as the one state that ought not to exist, that's anti-Semitic. And obviously there are lots of other direct statements that are anti-Semitic, to diminish or to insult Jews as a people, or to insult someone as a Jew, or to ascribe to them invidious characteristics as a people. Those are all anti-Semitic. And has there been a rise? I think there has been. probably overdetermined. Why questions are almost always overdetermined.
Sure.
You have
Sure.
lots and lots of reasons for that.
Yep.
And I devoutly hope that, Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, who was a great Hasidic rabbi of the 18th century, said, if you believe you can break, you must believe you can heal. So I believe that if anti-Semitism can rise, that it, God willing, could also fall.
Thank you. And that's actually connected to another question, which was, is it possible to criticize Israeli policy without being considered anti-Semitic?
Oh, sure, I do it all the time. And so does every Jew I know, although they may not do it publicly. Some do it publicly. All you have to do is read an Israeli newspaper. Israel has the most savagely self-critical press in the world. I mean, stuff that probably wouldn't make it into an American paper. So sure, I absolutely think you can not only criticize Israeli policy, you can think what they're doing is terrible. You could even say what they're doing is evil. And that's not necessarily anti-Semitic. Just to say, and therefore they shouldn't exist, that steps over the line.
Great, thank you. We have a question here from a Jewish student, and he says that he has found himself constantly defending his right to exist, self-determination, defending his people and his religion's legitimacy. And he wants to know, and this is what we've been covering, I think, how we can have these conversations with people who don't recognize Jewish history and legitimacy. And I think he's really expressing, as did another Jewish student, about feeling that they're on the front line of this now, and maybe surprised by that,
So,
among 20-something-year-olds, let's say.
At least a part of this has to do with the very strange position that Jews occupy in the cultural continuum in American life, and especially in American life, but not only. So to some people, Jews are white. To other people, Jews are not white. So if you go far enough on the right, Jews are not white. That's why a Klansman feels the same way about you and about me, because we're both not white in different ways, but equally hateful. If you go on the left, though, Jews represent whiteness, even though if you go to Israel, more than 50% of Israel's population actually comes from the Middle East. So I had a congregation, as I said, that was about 60% Persian, who all are various shades of brown. And that doesn't exactly compute. It's much easier if you have two categories, which is white and not white, to decide Jews are in that, because most of my encounter of Jews in America are people who look like, as I look. And therefore, Jews get consigned to categories that are both illegitimate and also that then wipe out the very, very long and dispiriting and awful history of Jewish suffering, because they're now in the everything is fine category as opposed to the suffering category. I don't know how to help complexify people's notions of what Jews are. Jews are a people that has been tremendously oppressed, that has also had, portions of them, great success. And one doesn't cancel the other. They can coexist. As the Chancellor said at the very beginning from F. Scott Fitzgerald, you have to be able to hold two opposing ideas in your mind at the same time and still be able to function. Jews are a very successful people that are also the subject of more hate crimes in America by far than any other religious group. I mean, like 80%. So how do those two things coexist? Well, they coexist because they do. Not because there's necessarily a good reason, but it's just true. And what I would say is to this questioner's friends is try not to assume that the categories in which you hold people are necessarily going to apply to the people whom you meet. One of the great qualities of human beings is they actually escape categories, and people are a constant surprise if you get to know them. It's one of the reasons why you can be married to someone for 50 years and they can say something that surprises you. How could that be? It's because people are of infinite possibility. It goes back to that first answer to the first question. If we're in the image of God, then there's no end to us. So be slower with your boxes and readier with your complexity.
But you mentioned race, and I think we really have to touch on it because I think in the American context, this is connected to so much of the conversation, and it's complicated by our own understandings of race and racism, the country's founding, and quite a number of things. Because in part, even you and I having this conversation, we have our individual groups of people, of which we actually have multiple groups of people to which we belong, have a long, complicated history in America. And so if we're talking about, let's say, African Americans and Jewish Americans, a long, complicated history. And part of what I think is going on in some of the debates and the conversations is actually really about race and how race functions in this country. And I don't know if we're providing enough space for that to be a part of the nuance of this.
I don't want to assume, and I don't know if I'm understanding you correctly, you'll have to tell me, I don't want to assume that the attitudes towards Palestinians have to do with race in this country, and if they do, then they shouldn't, because that's not a racial conflict. This, in America, race is a deep and important and constant accompaniment of our history, we know that. But that actually is not the case when, as I said, more than 50% of Israelis aren't of European origin to start off with, they're of Middle Eastern origin. This is not a conflict about race. And when people graft American racial conflicts onto the Middle East, they're making what we would call in philosophy a category error. The black-Jewish relations in America are a fascinating, interpenetrating, fraught question that I've actually dealt with a lot, but I don't think it's about that conflict. I think it's about something different, and we could have a really rich and interesting conversation about that one.
We'll do that another day. So, but thank you, and actually let's bookmark that, because that's a great conversation for us to have. And I will say, I do think that even part of what's happening in Palestine and in Israel is coded racially, and in part because of how Americans are looking at it. And so we have to get back to that, but I do want to respect the time and also a couple of other questions that we have. So a couple of people asked questions about how do they talk to friends and family members, people within their community, who they fundamentally disagree with. It's the question, I think, of, it's Thanksgiving dinner, and you have to figure out that your grandparents voted for the person that you thought they should not vote for. But how to have these complicated conversations, not between strangers, but between the people you love.
Yeah. I love this line from the comedian Kathy Landsman. She said, "Holidays are a chance to renew resentments afresh." And I always thought to some extent, this might not be the most popular opinion, but to some extent, I think there are some conversations that you just don't have because you can't have them with some people without their ending up in recrimination. And I really do, I think that the American tendency to assume everything must be expressed, there's a kind of immaturity about it. As you get older, you realize there are certain things that are better not said. They're just better not said. And yes, you might believe them, but if you don't say them, all it requires is that you bite your lip, and then later on you will be glad you didn't say it. Because things can't be unsaid. They can be not said, but they can't be unsaid. So that's one. And then the second is I go back to the interrogative. If you really want to have the conversation, then you have to understand why the person came to the conclusion that they did. And so, as an example, when I would speak to my Persian congregants who supported Trump, I would ask them, and they would tell me about how they grew up and the way they looked at the world. And I remember one of them saying to me once, they said, "Rabbi, you're a very nice person, but you grew up in Philadelphia. You did not grow up in Tehran." And they're right. So it wasn't a question of convincing them that they were wrong. It was a question of deepening my own understanding about why someone whom I knew, whom I liked and respected and I knew was a kind person, why they made that choice. And so if you're interested in understanding it, fine. But the problem is, as Emerson once said about Thoreau, why must he always talk for victory and never for truth? And we always want to win. We want to prove that you're wrong. We want to show you that you didn't get it right. And as long as that's your purpose, it's not going to work.
So I started off with the big question of the why religion, and I'll ask all of our panelists that question as we continue this series. And I want to end every conversation with the similar question, which is this: what gives you hope? What from your faith, your life, your experience, what gives you hope? We're in a moment that does not feel very hopeful. That feels as if what is a conflict and now a war just grows bigger and bigger. People are sad, they're angry, they're hurt, but there's something about the work that you do that must give you hope, because you're still here doing it. You're still traveling. You've come in the middle of an ICE event to talk to a university. So what gives you hope that's rooted and grounded perhaps in your faith?
Well, first of all, I'm constitutionally hopeful. I'm just lucky. I think I inherited this from my father. The way that I describe it to people is, my temperament is like when you take a dive into the Dead Sea. It's like I just come to the surface. I just do. I can't stay down for very long. But I think what gives me hope, paradoxically, is the same thing that worries me. And that is, people have an easy time disparaging groups of people, especially those they don't know. But when they engage people one-on-one, you realize that there is, in almost every person that you are willing to meet and listen to, there is something wonderful and remarkable, like looking into someone else's eyes. That's something that if it doesn't give you hope, you're not looking deeply enough. Human beings are remarkable, and at their best, they're astonishing. And we all know that we have darkness in us. But darkness, as one rabbi said, is the throne on which light sits. Like without that darkness, you wouldn't be able to have lights. And yes, it's true we have conflicts, but it is also true that we have made unbelievable progress in our history. If we think about where black people and Jewish people were 500 years ago, 400 years ago, 300 years ago, and I mean, for Jews, where we were 70 years ago or 80 years ago, when a third of my people were wiped out, and to think that we would actually have a state, that we would live lives of not perfect comfort in America, but safety that my ancestors would never have dreamed of. I always say, people used to come to my office and say, "Rabbi, I got cancer, why me?" But here's something they almost never said. "Rabbi, I was born to 2 loving parents in the richest country in the world, why me?" If we switch to the things, at least for a moment, without disparaging the things that are wrong and have to be fixed and are tragic and are painful, those exist. But there is so much that is good and kind and right, and I really do believe that God gave us everything we need to make this world better. It's just that we haven't always risen to the challenge. But I see potential and possibility everywhere, including profoundly and deeply, and I want to say gratefully, in the person sitting across from me.
Thank you, Rabbi. I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. I want to thank you for being so candid and honest with me and this conversation. And I think we have way more to talk about, and we'll do that either over dinner or another time. But thank you for coming to Vanderbilt University and being a part of our dialogues. And I just want to remind our audience that we will be continuing the conversation on February 22nd. We welcome Maha El-Jannati. She is the founder and executive director of Islamic Networks Group. So February 22nd, she will be here on campus. She is a well-renowned activist and leader in the American Muslim community in fighting against Islamophobia through her work at ING and at the University of California at Santa Cruz and around the country. That will be the second of several other conversations we are having with various faith leaders across the country of various backgrounds. We thank you for joining us. We thank you for tuning in to what will be a series of wonderful conversations. We thank you for sending your questions, and I hope on February 22nd to be able to see you all in person. Have a good night.